Hello, and welcome to 15-Minute Copyright Controversies. Um, in this video series, I'm going to be looking at copyright controversies in terms of enforcement and policy debates. In this instance, we're going to be talking about copyright versus plagiarism. These are two things that overlap a little bit, but not as much as people seem to think they do. They're very different, and it's kind of interesting, I think, to sort of look at their differences. So, what is copyright? Copyright is something that grants authors limited property in their works. It's designed to protect authors and artists. It is not controversial in and of itself. Most countries have some kind of copyright law, and there are important treaties like the TRIPS Agreement and the Berne Convention that really sort of take a look at how copyright is handled between borders. In the United States, it's governed exclusively by federal law. In other words, there is no state law that governs copyright. Depending on the work, an author may have an exclusive right to make copies, to publicly perform the work, or to make derivative works. This is a non-exhaustive list. When you think about it, there are other rights granted by copyright law. There is a distribution right. There is also a public display right. But it's going to vary by the kind of work. And of course, some things can't be copyrighted in the United States. Things like fashion designs and facts cannot be copyrighted. Although some things that are factual in nature can be copyrighted. A good example is an atlas. Even though an atlas is something that maps out and tells you what the land looks like, and thus is somewhat factual in nature, it itself is copyrightable, and you can prevent people from copying your atlas. Note that fashion designs can be protected by trademark. For example, if you've got like a Gucci bag, for example, Gucci often places trademarks on that bag to distinguish a Gucci bag from a knockoff, one that copies the design of the Gucci bag, but legally cannot copy any of the trademarks. If you do copy something without permission, that's infringement. So, and when we talk about copyright infringement, we're talking about making copies of a work, publicly performing the work, writing an unauthorized sequel. That's something you might see in like fan fiction, for example. Those are things you can't do. If you write a popular book, you have the right to make a sequel of it. You have the right to authorize a translation, to adapt it to another medium. Those are derivative works. If you do those things without the copyright holder, it's infringement, like I said before. The important thing is that it's the copyright holder that gets to make the authorization. There are some limiting doctrines, like the first sale doctrine. When I buy a book, the first sale of that book exhausts certain rights in that work, the copyright in that one specific work. And that's what allows a used bookstore to exist. That's what allows used DVD stores to exist, that sort of thing. Fair use. You can copy some things without authorization. Those instances would fall under fair use, usually. There's also the DMCA safe harbor provision that allows websites that host third-party or user-generated content to not be liable for copyright infringement in those instances when they abide by all the requirements to get that safe harbor. And that's where you end up with the with things like the DMCA takedown notice and stuff. The rights are going to vary by the kind of work. When you have a sound recording of a piece of music, the musician who performs that work, the sound engineers who create that work, the person or corporation that owns that recording isn't going to have a public performance right. And that's what allows radio to do what they do. That allows them to play music on the air. Now, the person who wrote the music is going to have a public performance right. But that person is different often from the person who owns the copyright and the sound recording itself. And you'll see that in certain situations where different people have different rights because of the way work is. Very important, infringement doesn't require a claim of ownership. And in fact, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of times what we're looking for isn't, something created by the person who's distributing it. We're looking for a specific thing. It's valuable to us because it isn't what that person created, it's what we ourselves want. And a good example of this might be a print at a convention. So an artist draws Spider-Man. They're not authorized by Marvel to draw Spider-Man, but they draw Spider-Man and they make a print of it, and they sell those prints at Artist Alley, for example, at a comic book convention. What we want is a picture of Spider-Man. We don't necessarily want what that person is drawing. There may be some desire to have maybe that specific person draw Spider-Man. But a lot of times what you'll see is like when you're talking about infringement, what makes that print popular is that it's Spider-Man. And you also see that with something like a movie, right? When you download a movie that is not authorized, right? When you make a pirated download or something, with that, right, you want the movie. You don't necessarily care about, whether or not the person who's distributing it is the one who made it. Sometimes you do, sometimes you want specifically an authorized copy, right? And that's when you might go to iTunes or something to download a movie rather than go to a torrent site. So that's one of the big differences between infringement and plagiarism. Plagiarism is in fact a claim of authorship. You didn't create it, but you're claiming authorship of it. It's not a legal doctrine, but there are ways to punish plagiarists because those things are typically governed by contract law. A code of honor is a good example. If you go to a school and they have a code of honor, it's usually something that covers plagiarism. Other agreements, contracts, that sort of thing. When you submit a manuscript to a publisher, you're basically saying to that publisher, I'm the person who wrote this. I have the right to do this. A teacher or a publisher may require that any work submitted be the authorship of the person submitting the work. If you're a teacher, what you want to grade what the person wrote. You don't want to grade what someone else wrote. The idea is to find out if the student is mastering the subject matter, and you don't get that if they're plagiarizing. Same thing with the publisher, right? If you're publishing someone's book, you want to be dealing with the author of that book. You don't want to be dealing with someone who took that work from someone else. And in that instance, you might actually overlap with copyright infringement. We'll talk a little bit about that later. In academic papers, an error in citation can give rights to plagiarism. If you copy from Wikipedia, if you're a student and you copy from Wikipedia and you don't attribute the quote at all, that could be plagiarism. If you fail to cite a scholarly source, that's very similar. If you don't have any sort of attribution to that source at all, then that would be plagiarism as well. But plagiarism can also be as bad as hiring someone to write a paper for you, right? If you want your best friend, give them $100 and they'll write they will write your paper for you. That's also plagiarism. It's not copyright infringement, but it's definitely plagiarism because then you're turning it and you're claiming it as yours. So we can sort of see this a little bit here. I got a nice little diagram here. It's not the best, but does a good job of sort of summarizing what we're talking about here. Illegally distributing a popular movie, TV show, book, a comic book even, that sort of thing would be copyright infringement. Performing a copyrighted play without paying royalties. For example, let's say I wanted to perform Hamilton. I can't do that, not without permission of the copyright holder. Distribution of an unauthorized sequel to a popular movie, TV show, book. You see that a lot in fan fiction, right? Where, you know, maybe you write a continuation of Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings or whatever, without the permission of Tolkien or J.K. Rowling. Maybe you want to sell prints of popular characters from copyrighted works without license. You want to sell a print of Spider-Man. You want to sell a print of Superman. You want to do Luke Skywalker and stick him on a t-shirt. If you don't have a license from the person who owns the copyright, if you don't have a license from Lucasfilm, Marvel, DC, whatever, then it's copyright infringement. Plagiarism. Copying from Wikipedia, turning in paper that you paid someone to write. Those are examples of plagiarism. Where they're going to overlap would be if you sold a manuscript to a publisher. You didn't write without the author's authorization. An example of that would be something like you, maybe you rummage through the trash can of Stephen King, and in there he's thrown out, you know, 3/4 of a book or something. And maybe you add to the last quarter. And you sell it to a publisher, and you don't tell them that Stephen King wrote 3/4 of that book. That's going to be plagiarism, and it's going to be copyright infringement. Because you've now duplicated somebody else's work without their permission. And something like that isn't going to fall under fair use or anything like that. In that instance, you know, if you think about it, that's where they overlap in kind of a strange way, because maybe you have some kind of like high quality work. Maybe you've sold something in the past, but you're having trouble writing something now. So you go to another source, and instead of getting permission or anything like that, you simply copy it wholesale without telling anybody. Some things aren't going to be infringement or plagiarism. And a good example of that is ghostwriting. When a celebrity has their memoir ghostwritten, or when some other work is ghostwritten, that's not going to be infringement or plagiarism. Another example might be a column written by a dean. Maybe a dean at a college has a column that's syndicated, but they don't write any of their columns. Instead, they have like an intern or a graduate student wrote that. That's not going to be infringement or plagiarism. Because a lot of times, particularly with celebrities, we understand that a lot of times they're not writing those things themselves. A work based on a public domain work isn't going to be either one either. You're creating an original work. And because it's public domain, you don't, you're allowed to copy from it. A good example of that would be West Side Story. West Side Story is based on the public domain, Romeo and Juliet. West Side Story has its own copyright, but there's no plagiarism involved in that, because no one thinks that Shakespeare wrote it, and the play itself isn't claiming any. It's an original work unto itself. A minor citation error where attribution exists, but the citation is improperly formatted. Very occasionally, I see people claiming that that's plagiarism, and it's not. If you're not claiming authorship of the work itself, then it's not plagiarism. The idea behind plagiarism is that you're claiming some sort of work in something that you didn't do. If you improperly format the citation, or if you don't put quotes around something, even though you make clear that that thing came from somewhere else, those might be other errors, and those might be worthy of a grade down or something in an academic setting, but they're not errors unto themselves. So, you know, there you go. That's just a little bit about copyright versus plagiarism. I do see some situations where those things get confused, where people talk about plagiarism as though it was a legal doctrine, and they usually confuse it with copyright infringement. And the problem with doing that is pretty straightforward. Copyright infringement often doesn't require any sort of claim that you are the author. And so, even in instances where you might claim authorship of something you didn't write, the thing you're writing may still be original unto itself. For example, you know, if you turn in a paper in an academic setting that has improper citations, you are not citing the things you need to cite. A lot of times what you are using, the quotes you are using, would fall under fair use, but it's still plagiarism because you're in violation of your school's academic code or whatever. Also, the creation of fan works or the creation of prints at a convention, those things don't fall under plagiarism either, even though they are most likely copyright infringement. So, that's pretty much the end of the slideshow. Hope you enjoyed it. That's it. Peace out.